Some disasters don't begin in the sky. They begin on the ground in a quiet cockpit on a clear morning, when everything still looks routine. A checklist is complete, engines are stable, and yet something doesn't feel right. A light that shouldn't be on. A number that doesn't match. A gut feeling that something's off. And still, the decision is made. In aviation, every flight begins with that moment, the final choice between waiting and taking off. Most of the time, it ends well. But history remembers the few that should never have left the ground. Crews under pressure, maintenance shortcuts, hidden malfunctions, and a clock that never stops ticking. Each of them carried the same illusion, that one more flight would be fine. These are the flights that prove how fragile confidence can be. Flights where warnings were ignored, systems misread, or schedules valued more than safety. Flights that remind us that the most dangerous word in aviation is not crash. It's go. Go. If you care about real aviation stories, if you believe these lessons matter, please subscribe, like, and share. It helps us keep telling the truth behind the decisions that changed everything. It was January 13th, 1982. Washington National Airport lay buried beneath a brutal snowstorm that had paralyzed the nation's capital. The temperature hovered well below freezing, visibility was poor, and the Potomac River ran dark and half-frozen beyond the runway. Air Florida Flight 90, a Boeing 737 bound for Fort Lauderdale with a stop in Tampa, waited in a long line of aircraft struggling to depart through the worsening weather. Inside the cockpit sat Captain Larry Wheaton and First Officer Roger Pettit. Both were young, competent pilots, but neither had much experience in this kind of winter operation. They had trained mostly in the warm air of southern routes. That morning, the delays had stretched to nearly 2 hours, as snow and ice coated the wings, tail, and engine inlets. De-icing trucks moved slowly from plane to plane, spraying heated glycol in the bitter cold. When the truck finally reached them, the de-icing seemed incomplete. The solution froze almost as soon as it hit the aircraft, leaving patches of white frost along the leading edges. The captain worried about further delays. Another round of de-icing would cost time and fuel. The airline was under pressure, schedules were tight, gates were full, and operations were already behind due to the storm. The crew decided to proceed. But the trouble didn't stop there. The aircraft taxied behind another jet to the threshold of runway 36. In the process, the Air Florida crew made a fatal mistake. To help break up ice buildup on the engines, they positioned themselves close behind the aircraft ahead, so close that the jet blast threw slush and snow into the Boeing's intakes and across the wings. Instead of melting ice, it covered the plane with a new layer of contamination. At 3:59 p.m., they received clearance for takeoff. Visibility was poor, but the runway lights cut faintly through the snow. As they began their roll, the first officer noticed something odd. "That doesn't seem right," he said. The engine readings looked too high for the sluggish acceleration they were feeling. The engines were producing power but not enough thrust. Ice within the pressure sensors had distorted the readings, tricking them into thinking the engines were performing normally. At rotation speed, the plane lifted off slowly, heavy, and unsteady. Immediately, the stick shaker sounded a stall warning. The wings, coated in a thin film of ice, could not generate lift. "We're not climbing," the captain called. The aircraft shuddered as it lost altitude, descending straight toward the river. The crew fought desperately to recover, but the Boeing struck the 14th Street Bridge less than half a mile from the runway, clipping vehicles before plunging into the icy Potomac. 78 people were killed, 74 on board and 4 on the bridge. 5 passengers survived, clinging to wreckage as the freezing water and current dragged them downstream. Helicopters and rescuers rushed to the scene, but conditions were brutal. One survivor, a flight attendant named Kelly Duncan, would later recall the silence between screams the moment the engines stopped and the world went white. Amid the chaos, one image burned into history. A man in the water passing a rescue line to others instead of taking it himself. He was later identified as Arland Williams, a passenger who gave his life to save strangers. When the helicopter returned for him, he was gone. The investigation revealed a series of small, compounding failures. The aircraft had taken off with ice and snow on its wings and stabilizers. The engine power readings were inaccurate because the probes had been iced over. The crew failed to use anti-ice systems properly and did not reject the takeoff despite obvious signs of poor acceleration. The airline had provided minimal cold weather training, but the deepest cause was human. A mix of inexperience, schedule pressure, and the belief that it's probably fine. Those words had taken off with them. After the crash, regulations changed. Airlines were required to implement stricter de-icing procedures, and flight crews received new cold weather training programs. Anti-ice system checklists were revised. The lessons from Air Florida Flight 90 were written into manuals worldwide, yet the images of that day remained far more powerful than any regulation. In the frozen heart of Washington, a routine flight lasted barely 30 seconds after liftoff. It showed how a single decision, the choice to go when waiting was safer, can turn an ordinary delay into an irreversible tragedy. It was August 20th, 2008. The sun burned across the tarmac at Madrid Barajas Airport, a dry heat shimmering above the asphalt. Spanair Flight 5022. A McDonnell Douglas MD-82 bound for Las Palmas sat at the gate. 172 people were on board, many families heading for summer holidays in the Canary Islands. The aircraft looked ready. The reality was far from it. During the first attempt to depart earlier that day, the crew had noticed a technical issue, an air temperature probe heater fault. The takeoff was aborted, and maintenance was called. Ground technicians, under time pressure, and following a quick troubleshooting routine, decided to disable the heater system rather than replace the faulty part. The plane was cleared to fly. The clock kept ticking. The crew, already delayed by over an hour, prepared for a second attempt. Inside the cockpit were Captain Antonio Mulet and First Officer Francisco Mulet, both experienced and well-trained, but tired. The August heat pressed into the cabin, the passengers restless, the schedule behind. As they began their pre-flight checklists again, one small but fatal detail went unnoticed. The aircraft's flaps and slats, the movable surfaces that give lift during takeoff, were never extended. On the MD-82, the takeoff warning system, or TAWS, is designed to alert the pilots if the plane is not properly configured for takeoff. It sounds a horn when power is applied with flaps, slats, or trim in the wrong position. But during maintenance, when the temperature probe system was disabled, a circuit breaker shared with the TAWS system had also been pulled. No one realized the warning horn was now silent. At 2:24 p.m., Spanair 5022 began its takeoff roll on runway 36 left. Acceleration felt normal, but as the aircraft lifted off, the nose rose steeply and the wings failed to produce the expected lift. Stall warnings blared, and within seconds the MD-82 began to sink. The captain pulled harder on the control column, believing more pitch meant more lift. It didn't. The right wing clipped the ground, and the aircraft cartwheeled across a field beyond the runway, bursting into flames. The impact and fire killed 154 people. Only 18 survived. The investigation by Spain's CIAIAC found that the crew had failed to extend the flaps and slats, but the real question was why. The answer revealed layers of systemic failure, fatigue, time pressure, routine complacency, and a maintenance shortcut that unintentionally silenced the last line of defense. The TAWS system had been inoperative, but no one noticed. The design flaw in its circuit logic meant one maintenance action could disable both unrelated systems. Spanair itself was struggling financially at the time, cutting costs wherever possible. Crews faced heavy workloads, minimal rest, and the constant expectation to meet schedules. On that day, the captain was working his fourth consecutive flight segment in extreme heat. His mind was focused on performance charts, speeds, and delays, not on whether the flaps were extended. In the months after the crash, regulators demanded design reviews for similar aircraft. Airlines re-emphasized checklist discipline and maintenance coordination. Yet Spanair's reputation never recovered. Within 3 years, the airline ceased operations entirely. The tragedy of Flight 5022 wasn't born in the air. It began when a known fault was patched instead of repaired. When one circuit fed two critical systems, and when the need to depart outweighed the instinct to pause. It was proof that in aviation, silence can be deadly, especially when it replaces the sound of a warning horn that was never meant to fail. It was the morning of December 12, 1985. A McDonnell Douglas DC-8 chartered by Aero Air stood at the end of runway 22 in Gander, Newfoundland. The aircraft carried 248 members of the United States Army's 101st Airborne Division, returning home from peacekeeping duty in the Sinai. They were tired, cold, and eager to get home before Christmas. The stop in Gander was meant to be routine, just refueling before the final leg to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, but the air was bitterly cold. The temperature hovered around -4 degrees Celsius, with freezing drizzle and thin snow crystals floating through the night air. The DC-8 had been parked for more than an hour, exposed to the conditions. Ice formed silently on the wing's leading edges, a thin, nearly invisible layer that would change everything. At 6:45 in the morning, the aircraft lined up for takeoff. The 4 engines surged to full thrust, and the jet began its roll. As it accelerated, everything appeared normal at first. Then, after rotation, the climb seemed shallow. The speed stopped increasing. The nose rose higher, but the wings could not produce lift. Within seconds, the heavy aircraft began to shudder. The stick shaker activated, warning of an impending stall. The crew tried to correct, but the DC-8 was already losing control. Witnesses on the nearby highway saw the jet appear briefly above the tree line before banking to the right. It struck the frozen ground just beyond the runway and erupted in flames. The impact scattered wreckage across a patch of forest less than a kilometer from the airport. There were no survivors. The investigation would find multiple contributing factors. The aircraft had likely been contaminated with ice, disrupting airflow and lift. The plane was also carrying more weight than declared fuel, baggage, and equipment that pushed it beyond safe limits. But there were deeper problems too. De-icing had not been requested. No one had verified the wing condition before departure. The crew had been awake for more than 20 hours. Some board members believed a small explosion occurred after takeoff. But the majority concluded the stall and crash were consistent with icing and overloading. The truth, regardless of theory, pointed to one certainty. The aircraft was never ready to fly. Aero Air Flight 1285 should have stayed on the ground. Instead, a combination of fatigue, time pressure, and invisible ice turned a routine departure into a national tragedy. The wreckage burned through the snow for hours, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous decision a crew can make is the one to go. It was the night of November 28, 2016. A British Aerospace Avro RJ-85 belonging to LaMia Airlines lined up on the runway in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. The aircraft carried 77 people, including the entire Chapecoense football team from Brazil, journalists, and crew members. They were on their way to Medellin, Colombia, to play in the first leg of the Copa Sudamericana final, a match that would have been the biggest in the club's history. The crew had filed their flight plan directly from Santa Cruz to Medellin, a route of nearly 3,000 kilometers. On paper, the Avro RJ-85 could barely make that distance at maximum range. But this flight was already doomed by a simple, unforgivable fact. The tanks were not full enough to make it safely. The plane took off with almost no fuel reserves. It was an illegal flight plan, one that violated every rule of commercial aviation. Inside the cockpit, the captain was not only the pilot but also a co-owner of LaMia. He had made this flight before, pushing the limits of the aircraft's range. The crew knew it would be tight, but the schedule, the publicity, and the pride of making the charter happen outweighed caution. They departed Santa Cruz just after 6 in the evening, climbing smoothly into the night sky. For most of the flight, everything seemed routine. The passengers laughed, filmed videos, and sang team chants. The cabin lights dimmed as they crossed into Colombian airspace. Then, as they neared their destination, the situation changed. Controllers at Medellin's José María Cordova International Airport informed them that another aircraft had declared an emergency and was being prioritized for landing. LaMia Flight 2933 was instructed to enter a holding pattern. As the aircraft circled, the engines began to sputter. The fuel gauges were nearly empty. The crew made no formal mayday call, only mentioning fuel problems. By the time the controllers understood the severity, it was too late. The engines began flaming out one by one. The cabin lights flickered. The aircraft, now powerless, glided through the darkness toward the mountains of Cerro Gordo. At 9:58 p.m., the Avro RJ-85 struck a ridge just 20 kilometers short of Medellin. The impact tore the fuselage apart. Of the 77 people on board, only 6 survived. The investigation later confirmed what everyone suspected. The airplane had run out of fuel. There was no technical failure, no storm, no sabotage. It was a preventable human decision. The crew had planned a flight that exceeded the aircraft's safe range by roughly 20 minutes. Regulations required an alternate airport and at least 45 minutes of reserve fuel. They had neither. Investigators uncovered a culture of negligence within LaMia: minimal oversight, ignored warnings, and pilots pressured to complete flights no matter the risk. Maintenance records showed repeated instances of rule violations. The Bolivian Civil Aviation Authority had approved the plan without questioning its feasibility. The system had failed at every level. The tragedy struck the world not just as an aviation disaster but as a human one. Chapecoense lost nearly its entire roster, coaching staff, and journalists covering their dream season. Vigils were held across Brazil. Medellin's Atlético Nacional, their would-be opponent, requested that Chapecoense be awarded the championship in honor of the fallen. LaMia Flight 2933 was the very definition of a flight that should never have taken off. It represented the fatal consequences of pride, complacency, and a disregard for rules written in blood. It showed that aviation disasters don't only come from malfunctions sometimes. They begin the moment someone says, "We'll make it anyway." It was July 25, 2000. The supersonic icon of the skies, Air France Concorde, stood ready at Charles de Gaulle Airport. The flight was destined for New York as Flight 4590. 97 passengers and 9 crew members filled the narrow cabin, most of them German tourists bound for a luxury cruise. The crew, led by Captain Christian Marty, a veteran pilot and world-class parachutist, prepared the slender white jet for takeoff. It was a perfect summer afternoon, the kind of day when nothing should go wrong. But before the engines even spooled up, fate was already waiting on the runway. Minutes earlier, a Continental Airlines DC-10 had taken off. From its left engine cowling, a thin strip of titanium no longer than 45 centimeters had fallen unnoticed onto the asphalt. For any other plane, it might have been harmless debris. For the Concorde, with its razor-thin tires and takeoff speed exceeding 200 knots, it was a hidden catastrophe. At 4:43 p.m., the Concorde began its takeoff roll on runway 26 right. The aircraft was heavy, fueled near its limits to cross the Atlantic. Acceleration was normal at first, the Olympus engines howling with that unmistakable thunder. Then, at 180 knots, the left main tire struck the titanium strip. In less than a tenth of a second, the tire exploded. A 20-centimeter chunk of rubber flew upward, slamming into the underside of the left wing. The Concorde's wing was full of fuel, pressurized, thin as a knife's edge. The rubber impact punctured the tank, sending a shockwave through the structure. Fuel began pouring out under pressure, spraying directly into the path of the engine's exhaust. Within seconds, it ignited. Flames stretched 10 meters behind the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the crew saw engine number 2 fail. Then engine number 1. The airspeed stopped increasing. They were already beyond V1, the decision speed. They could not abort. The Concorde was committed to flight. Captain Marty fought to keep the aircraft straight as it roared down the runway. Tower controllers saw fire trailing behind the jet and shouted warnings over the radio. In the cabin, passengers stared out the windows at the glowing orange plume. The aircraft lifted off barely. It climbed to 200 feet, struggling to gain altitude as the left wing burned. The fire damaged wiring and hydraulics, destroying thrust symmetry. When the engines on the left lost power, the plane rolled left, unable to recover. At 4:44 p.m. Just 90 seconds after the tire burst, the Concorde struck a hotel near the town of Gonesse, 2 miles from the airport. All 109 people on board were killed, along with 4 on the ground. The investigation by the BEA revealed a chain of small, preventable causes. The titanium strip had been installed illegally. It was not the correct material for the DC-10's thrust reverser. Concorde's tires, known to be fragile, lacked containment liners that could have prevented debris penetration. Maintenance had not corrected known wear on the landing gear. And crucially, the aircraft was overloaded by nearly 1 ton. In the aftermath, the entire Concorde fleet was grounded for more than a year. Engineers redesigned the fuel tanks with Kevlar liners, reinforced the tires, and revised operational limits. But the damage to Concorde's reputation and the changing economics of supersonic flight sealed its fate. When it returned to service, passenger confidence never truly came back. Concorde Flight 4590 was more than a technical accident. It was a warning about arrogance, about believing that perfection doesn't need change. The world's most advanced passenger jet was lost not to the limits of engineering, but to the smallest piece of metal left behind on the runway. It was the night of February 6, 1996. The air around Puerto Plata, on the northern coast of the Dominican Republic, was warm, calm, and heavy with salt. Birgenair Flight 301, a Boeing 757, chartered to carry German tourists back to Frankfurt, sat quietly on the apron at Gregorio Luperone International Airport. It was a late-night departure, a routine flight for a crew accustomed to long-haul charters. But this one would become one of the most haunting examples of how a simple mechanical fault, misunderstood and misread, could destroy a modern jet within minutes of takeoff. The aircraft, registered TC Gen, had been parked for 25 days before the flight. The airline's winter schedule had slowed, and the plane sat unused in the humid coastal air. No one knew it, but during that time, small mud dauber wasps had crawled into one of the pitot tubes, the small, slender probes on the nose that measure airspeed, and built a nest inside. It was nearly invisible to the naked eye, but it completely blocked the tube. The flight was cleared to depart, without anyone checking the pitots with protective covers or airflow tests. Captain Ahmet Erdem was in command, a veteran with over 24,000 hours of flight experience. His first officer, Mulis Evrenesoglu, was younger but competent, with about 8,000 hours logged. The crew completed the pre-flight checklist. Nothing appeared abnormal. The Boeing's 3 air data systems each took input from separate pitot tubes. On the captain's side, however, the readings would soon be false. At 11:42 p.m., the engines spooled up, and the 757 began its takeoff roll down runway 8. The acceleration felt normal, but within seconds of liftoff, a subtle confusion began. The captain's airspeed indicator showed rapidly increasing speed much higher than the first officer's. One display showed the aircraft accelerating beyond 300 knots, while still climbing steeply. The first officer's instruments disagreed, showing a much lower value. The captain, trusting his own instruments, reduced thrust slightly, believing the aircraft was overspeeding. In reality, it was dangerously slow. The autopilot, sensing conflicting data, disengaged. Warnings began to fill the cockpit. Overspeed clackers, stick shaker alarms, and flight director deviations. Each system, reading from different sensors, delivered a different interpretation of the flight's condition. As the Boeing climbed through 4,000 feet, chaos took over. The stick shaker activated, warning of an impending stall, but the crew ignored it. They were convinced the overspeed alarm was true. Seconds later, the autopilot disengaged for good. The nose began to drop. Airspeed fluctuated wildly between too high and too low, and the altimeter needle began to unwind. The captain's side continued showing extreme overspeed. He pulled back hard, believing he needed to climb. The jet entered a steep stall. In the cabin, the passengers, mostly German holidaymakers, had no idea what was happening. The engines roared as thrust surged and dropped. In the final seconds, the aircraft rolled right and entered a spiral descent. The crew shouted conflicting instructions. The first officer called out, "We're losing speed," but the captain's instruments said the opposite. At 11:47 p.m., barely 5 minutes after takeoff, Birgenair Flight 301 struck the Atlantic Ocean nose first, just off the Dominican coast. All 189 people on board were killed. The investigation revealed that the captain's pitot tube was completely blocked, most likely by insect debris accumulated while the plane sat parked. Because of that blockage, the airspeed indicator on his side showed false readings that increased with altitude. The flight management computers, fed by that faulty input, sent erroneous warnings to the autopilot and overspeed protection systems. The crew, overwhelmed by conflicting alarms, could not identify which data source was correct. The tragedy exposed deep systemic flaws in Birgenair's operations and the industry's training philosophy at the time. The pilots had no clear procedure for handling multiple contradictory warnings from flight instruments. CRM crew resource management broke down completely as both pilots fixated on their own indicators. The relief pilot, sitting behind them, tried to intervene, but was ignored. Further investigation showed that had the crew cross-checked the standby airspeed indicator, which used an independent sensor, they would have recognized the problem instantly. But in the confusion of multiple warnings, that simple check was lost. In the months that followed, investigators recreated the event in simulators. Every time, the same pattern appeared. The human brain's instinct to trust the loudest alarm and the gauge directly in front of the captain's eyes. The crash forced a fundamental change in how pilots are trained to handle unreliable airspeed. The lesson became one of aviation's core doctrines: trust, attitude, and power, not instruments that disagree. Birgenair Flight 301 was not just a case of mechanical failure. It was a tragedy born of human limits, how stress, noise, and overconfidence can paralyze even skilled aviators. The pitot tube was only a few centimeters wide, but inside it, The seeds of disaster had quietly taken root long before the engines ever started. When the ocean finally settled that night, rescuers found fragments of the Boeing floating among fuel slicks and luggage. The cockpit voice recorder ended with confusion, disbelief, and silence. It was a flight that should have never left the ground, and a tragedy that taught the world that even the smallest obstruction can blind the most powerful machines. It was December 28, 2014. Early morning local time at Cubana International Airport in Surabaya. AirAsia Flight 8501. An Airbus A320-216, registered PKAXC, taxied out on its route to Singapore's Changi Airport. 162 people were on board. 155 passengers and 7 crew members. The departure looked routine. The sky was gray. There were cumulonimbus clouds ahead, but nothing out of the ordinary for the region. From the beginning, however, the flight had warning signs. Maintenance logs showed repeated occurrences of a fault in the Rudder Travel Limiter System, RTLU, and Flight Augmentation Computer, FAC, resets. The same aircraft had faced at least 23 similar warnings in the year prior. These were treated as non-critical, repeat issues, and resolved by resetting the system rather than fully diagnosing the root cause. The crew on board Flight 8501 had noted the repeated fault, but the decision was made to operate the flight anyway. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft climbed toward its cruise altitude of 32,000 feet. The crew requested a change of altitude to avoid weather, asking to climb to 38,000 feet, a request that ATC initially denied because of other traffic. Meanwhile, the ECAM display alerted Rudder Travel Limiter fault. Instead of following standard procedure requiring the plane to divert or troubleshoot on the ground, the captain initiated a non-standard reset of both flight augmentation computers. With the autopilot still engaged and protections in normal law, the system degraded to alternate law as the FACs were manually cycled. The aircraft entered a climb, then a left turn. At that moment, the protections afforded by normal flight law vanished. Airspeed and altitude began to fluctuate. The crew became aware of a problem. Multiple alarms sounded. Autopilot disengaged. Stick shaker stall warnings. Overspeed and underspeed warnings flashing. Despite these warnings, the captain did not apply the standard recovery action of reducing pitch and adding power. Instead, confusion grew in the cockpit. One pilot called, "pull down," but the other instinctively pulled up. With dual inputs canceling one another, the Airbus rolled into an extended stall. The jet descended rapidly through 30,000 feet, 38,000 feet, then below. The last radar contact showed altitude loss exceeding 6,000 feet per minute. The aircraft impacted the Java Sea near the Karimata Strait. There were no survivors. The wreckage and flight recorders were eventually recovered. The final investigation by Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, KNKT, concluded that the initiating event was the unresolved rudder control computer fault. But the ultimate cause of the crash was the crew's inappropriate response to system malfunction. They attempted a high-altitude restart procedure, while in adverse weather, lost flight protections, entered a stall, and did not take recovery action in time. The report made clear, all of this could have been avoided had the aircraft remained on the ground until the fault was properly fixed, or had the crew immediately followed the diversion procedures when the RTLU fault recurred. AirAsia Flight 8501 illustrates how an aircraft can appear fit for flight, yet carry a fatal seed. When recurring faults are treated as benign, when crew decisions prioritize schedule over safety, when systems degrade silently. Every indicator on takeoff looked acceptable, yet within minutes, the protections that the crew counted on were gone. The long logs of minor faults, the pressure to depart, the delay-laden schedule, they all pointed to one hard truth. This was a flight that should never have taken off. In the end, the crash claimed 162 lives. The Jordan of aviation learned again that the best documented engine or system fault still cannot replace one basic rule of flight. If anything about the aircraft or the crew's readiness is uncertain, stay on the ground. It was the morning rush hour in Taipei on February 4th, 2015. The city was just waking up, traffic building, ferries crossing the Keelung River, and thousands of people unaware that one of the most shocking aviation events ever caught on camera was about to unfold above them. TransAsia Airways Flight 235, NATR 72600 twin turboprop, was departing Songshan Airport on a short domestic flight to Kinmen Island. On board were 58 people, 5 crew and 53 passengers. The weather was typical for the region: overcast skies, light drizzle, visibility acceptable for departure. In the cockpit, Captain Liao Qian-sung, 42 years old, was the pilot flying. He had more than 4,000 flight hours and was known as conscientious but cautious. Beside him sat First Officer Liu Tzu-chung, 45 years old, the pilot monitoring. Both were qualified on the ATR-72, but the airline's safety culture had been under pressure in recent years after several incidents involving training and engine failure procedures. At 10:51 a.m., the aircraft began its takeoff roll on runway 10, rotating smoothly into the humid Taipei air. The climb was normal until just after passing 1,300 feet. Suddenly, the master warning alarm sounded. The left engine, number 2, had auto-feathered the propeller blades, changed pitch to reduce drag. The electronic engine control system detected a power anomaly and shut down fuel flow. The crew's workload spiked instantly. "Mayday! Mayday! Engine flameout!" The captain radioed to air traffic control. But what happened next would turn a single-engine event into a dual-engine catastrophe. Within seconds of the first alert, the captain made a fateful error. Instead of following the checklist or confirming which engine had failed, he reached for the wrong power lever and pulled the throttle on the right engine, the one still producing power. The torque on both engines fell to near zero. The aircraft began to lose airspeed. The cockpit voice recorder captured the confusion. "Check power," said the first officer. "Number 1 engine. Number 1's feathered." The captain responded, "Shut off number 1. But he was mistaken. Number 1 was the working engine. The left engine, number 2, was already auto-feathered and shut down. The right engine was still good until that moment. As the aircraft climbed through 1,500 feet, both propellers were now feathered, both engines producing no thrust. The airspeed dropped to under 100 knots. The stick shaker activated, warning of an imminent stall. But the captain, misled by stress and confirmation bias, pulled back further on the control column, a natural but fatal instinct to gain altitude while losing lift. The ATR began to roll left, then right, the stall warning blaring continuously. "Restart engine!" shouted the first officer. They tried switching ignition back on, pushing levers forward, but it was too late. The aircraft had lost all climb performance. At 10:53 a.m., barely 2 minutes and 30 seconds after takeoff, Flight 235 descended uncontrollably over the city. Dashcam footage from cars on Taipei's Nanhu Bridge captured the horrifying final seconds. The aircraft rolling sharply left, its wing clipping a taxi and the bridge railing before plunging inverted into the Keelung River. The footage would circle the world within hours, a rare, tragic, visual record of loss of control in real time. Of the 58 people on board, only 15 survived. The rest perished in the impact and subsequent breakup of the fuselage. Miraculously, everyone on the ground survived, though some were injured by debris. The investigation led by Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council revealed a chain of preventable human and organizational failures. The initial fault, a sensor issue that caused the left engine's automatic shutdown, was not catastrophic. The ATR-72 was fully capable of climbing safely on one engine. The problem arose when the captain, overwhelmed by the sudden alarm and a cascade of confusing cockpit warnings, misidentified the failed engine and reduced power on the wrong one. Data showed that after throttling down the healthy engine, he shut off its fuel supply completely. Seconds later, he tried to restart it, but the altitude loss and aerodynamic stall made recovery impossible. The crew's communication also broke down. The first officer repeatedly mentioned Engine 1, but never directly challenged the captain's action, likely due to deference and cockpit hierarchy. A problem that had caused numerous accidents in Asian carriers prior to this. The final report concluded that TransAsia's training program had not adequately prepared crews for high-stress engine failure scenarios. Recurrent simulator exercises had emphasized procedural drills, but not real-time decision-making or cross-verification between pilots. The airline's management culture also placed subtle pressure on captains to make rapid, confident decisions, discouraging hesitation, a deadly bias when uncertainty should prompt caution. After the crash, regulators grounded TransAsia's ATR fleet for inspection. A year later, the airline itself ceased operations entirely. New regulations mandated improved crew resource management, CRM, standards across Taiwanese carriers, emphasizing open communication and challenge response discipline in the cockpit. Flight 235 remains one of the most analyzed examples of startle effect and confirmation bias in modern aviation. It wasn't the mechanical fault that doomed the flight, but the mind's reaction to it. Under stress, the captain trusted instinct over evidence, and in doing so, shut down the only engine still capable of saving the aircraft. The image of that ATR, banking steeply above the river before vanishing from sight, became a symbol of how quickly training, experience, and technology can collapse when human perception turns against itself. In aviation, errors often start with a single movement, one lever pulled the wrong way, and end with lessons written in heartbreak. It was May 18, 2018, a hot, humid morning in Havana, Cuba. Jose Marti International Airport shimmered under the tropical sun as passengers boarded a Boeing 737-200 chartered from the Mexican company Global Air, also known as Demoge Airlines. The flight was operated on behalf of Cubana de Aviación as Flight 972, bound for the city of Holguín in eastern Cuba. There were 113 people on board, 107 passengers, 6 crew members. From the outside, it looked like a normal domestic flight, another routine departure for Cubana's aging fleet. But in reality, almost nothing about the airplane or its operation was normal. The aircraft, registered XAUHZ, was 40 years old. It had flown under several airlines since the late 1970s and had seen decades of use. Its maintenance history was patchy, its records incomplete, and its operating company, Global Air, had already been suspended twice before for safety concerns. Yet the plane was approved to fly again, a decision that would soon prove catastrophic. At 12:08 p.m., the Boeing taxied to runway 06 for takeoff. The temperature on the tarmac was more than 30 degrees Celsius, humidity near 90% conditions that made the engines work harder, reducing performance. In the cockpit were Captain Jorge Luis, an experienced Mexican pilot, and First Officer Miguel Angel. As the aircraft began its takeoff roll, witnesses recalled the sound of the engines straining unusually loud. The rotation looked steep, too steep for the speed it had achieved. Moments after liftoff, the Boeing began to roll to the right. The nose pitched up aggressively. Airspeed fell. V1. Rotate, someone said, but the climb rate faltered almost immediately. At less than 100 seconds after takeoff, the plane banked sharply to the right right wing dipped, and it descended into a field near the Boyeros neighborhood just beyond the runway. A massive fireball rose into the sky, visible across Havana. Only 3 passengers were pulled alive from the wreckage. 2 later died in the hospital. In the end, one survivor remained a 19-year-old woman who suffered severe burns and fractures. Every other person on board was killed. The images that followed were devastating. Twisted metal scattered across green fields, firefighters battling a blaze that consumed what was left of the fuselage, and the tail section, the only recognizable piece standing upright amid the smoke. For Cubana, it was the country's deadliest air disaster in 30 years. For the world, it was a shocking reminder of how fragile safety can become when oversight fails. The investigation by Cuba's Instituto de Aeronáutica, civil IACC, assisted by Mexican authorities, soon uncovered a grim reality. The Boeing had taken off overweight. Passenger baggage, fuel, and cargo had exceeded the maximum safe load for the high-temperature, high-humidity conditions of Havana. Worse, performance charts used by the crew did not properly reflect the airplane's true capabilities. They were based on factory-fresh data from decades earlier. In simple terms, the aircraft was flyable, but not airworthy. Maintenance logs revealed repeated issues with the engines, flaps, and control systems. Former Global Air pilots told investigators that the company routinely skipped critical inspections, falsified log entries, and pressured crews to fly despite known defects. One pilot said he had quit after reporting that the same aircraft was barely capable of takeoff at full load. These warnings were ignored. The culture of "make it fly somehow" had taken root. On the day of the accident, that culture met physics. The hot air reduced engine thrust. The excessive pitch after rotation caused an aerodynamic stall, and an uneven power distribution between the engines made the roll unrecoverable. The crew had only seconds to react, but even perfect piloting could not overcome the aircraft's compromised performance envelope. The final report concluded that the immediate cause of the crash was loss of control after takeoff due to weight and balance miscalculation and possible engine power asymmetry. But behind that simple line was a web of negligence. Weak oversight, poor maintenance practices, and the outsourcing of safety to the lowest bidder. In the aftermath, Cuba suspended all operations with foreign-leased aircraft from Global Air. Mexico's aviation authority revoked the company's operating certificate permanently after audits revealed widespread irregularities in its maintenance and training programs. Yet for many in Cuba, the disaster cut deeper than regulations. It exposed the desperation of a national carrier forced to rely on aging, second-hand planes in a world where newer jets were unaffordable. Flight 972 was more than a crash. It was a consequence of decay, a mirror held up to what happens when rules are treated as suggestions and inspections as paperwork. The Boeing 737 had been kept alive far past its safe limit, flying on patched systems and trust. On that May afternoon, it ran out of both. When the fire was finally extinguished, the wreckage lay in silence. The last survivor later told reporters she remembered only the sound of people praying as the plane climbed, and then, nothing. The tragedy of Flight 972 stands as a warning written in the smoke above Havana. That even in modern aviation, safety begins not in the sky, but on the ground in every inspection, every calculation, and every decision that says go when it should have said stop. In the end, every flight, no matter how advanced the aircraft, how modern the systems, or how experienced the crew, comes down to one decision: go or no go. It sounds simple, yet behind those three words lies everything that defines aviation: judgment, discipline, and the courage to say no when pressure demands yes. Every disaster in this story began before the wheels left the ground. A warning ignored, a number misread, a checklist skipped, a system deferred for later repair. The aircraft were airworthy on paper, but not in truth. The flights departed because humans convinced themselves that risk was manageable, that one more flight would be fine. And in that small gap between fine and fatal, hundreds of lives were lost. The lesson is not new, but it is easily forgotten. Weather, weight, fatigue, schedule, these are constant pressures on every flight deck. But aviation's greatest strength has always been its willingness to learn from pain. Today, performance data, safety margins, and oversight systems all exist to protect that single moment of decision at the start of a runway. Yet, the captain's voice still matters most. Every checklist, every warning light, every advisory from dispatch leads to that same moment, the push of the throttles, or the call to abort. When hesitation creeps in, when something doesn't feel right, experience whispers the truth. You can always wait, but you can't go back. These flights, Concorde 4590, Spanair 5022, Aero Air 1285, LaMia 2933, Air Florida 90, Birgenair 301, AirAsia 8501, TransAsia 235, and Cubana 972 all shared one thing. Each could have been saved if the engines had never started, if the brakes had never been released, if someone had said, "Let's stop here." In aviation, courage is not just flying into storms or landing in emergencies. Sometimes, courage is staying on the ground. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, and share. It truly helps us continue telling these stories with care and accuracy. Because every story like this reminds us why safety exists, and why the choice between go and no-go will always be the most important one a pilot ever makes.